Happy Halloween, and thank you for joining me on my series Asylum Sundays for this Halloween double feature. I can't believe I pulled it off. These videos are hard to do when you do it alone and don't know what you're doing, so thank you for bearing with me while I learn. Today's case is about the vampire of Sacramento. He was a cannibal, a serial killer, and a spree killer, and a huge reminder to take your meds if you're on them. This case has a severe trigger warning. Babies and animals are involved in this case. It's not pretty. If you have seen Twilight, you cannot at me. What happens in this case is severely disturbing, and it is for mature audiences only, and I mean over 18. If you have children around, add this to your watch later, and do not continue. Thank you in advance. Richard Chase was born on May 23rd, 1950, so that makes him a Gemini, and he was born in Santa Clara, California. His parents were Richard Chase Sr., who was a computer specialist, and Beatrice, who was a teacher. The family moved to Sacramento, California when he was about 3 years old. He had one sibling, Pamela, who was born soon after the family moved to Sacramento. He had a pretty normal life. As a child, he was in Little League, Boy Scouts, and pretty well liked by other kids and teachers. In the public eye, his family was basically normal, happy. Unfortunately, behind closed doors, it was a much different story, like many of the Leave It to Beaver families in the 50s. Richard's parents were known to be strict disciplinary types who were strong believers in physical and emotional punishments. An example of this would be when Richard was 2 years old, his father force-fed him until he barfed all over the place. His sister even said that their father and him would fight quite often, and the father would shake him and slam him against the walls. Now, I didn't know them, so all of this is alleged. Richard's father was said to have been an alcoholic who blew his money, so oftentimes the kids would see their parents in these explosive arguments. The mother would scream things at their father about him doing drugs, trying to poison her, and would often accuse him of cheating. Please remember that she thought that he was trying to poison her for later. With all the tension in the house, it's no surprise that Richard became introverted, shy, and was often ignored by his parents, allegedly. Richard was a bedwetter and was growing increasingly dark. At the age of 10 years old, he started to become more strange and started secretly killing cats around the neighborhood. He killed so many cats, in fact, that the neighbors started talking about the disappearance of all these cats. His mom even found one dead and buried in her garden. But it wasn't just cats he was known to kill. He also killed birds, rabbits, and dogs. And later, humans. Around 13 years old, Richard's family life got much worse, and his parents lost their house. They were fighting more than ever. His parents seemed to be so stuck in their own toxicity that they brushed off or didn't even notice Richard's weird behavior growing increasingly strange. This was about the same time that Richard started to grow fond of fire, heat, and burning things. His mom later recalled that he would get up in the middle of the night to cook for himself and would burn pans on purpose. He would even turn the heater up as high as it would go and lay on the couch naked. And he also started using matches to start small fires. This fits young Richard into the McDonald triad perfectly, which is also called the triad of evil. There are the 3 signs in childhood that your kid may actually turn out to be a literal sociopathic serial killer. These signs are animal cruelty, fire setting, and bedwetting past age 5. And though this theory has mostly been debunked, there are a lot of serial killers that fit the bill. For example, Ed Kemper was the poster child of the McDonald triad. Though these traits are said to be early warning signs of a serial killer, they often stem from sexual, physical, and emotional abuses. So if your kid is acting like this, you may want to take him to the doctor and a therapist as soon as possible and make sure that nothing's happening to them that you're not aware of. During 9th grade, Richard's parents split up and his mother moved him and his sister to Los Angeles, where they stayed with some of their family members. About 8 days later, his dad came and swooped Richard up, but only Richard. A boy needs his dad after all, I guess. His mom eventually wore down and went back to Richard Sr. During high school, Richard was well-groomed, he had friends, and he even dated a few ladies. But none of these relationships would continue because, well, though his name is Richard and his nickname could have been Dick, he wasn't called Hard Richard, if you know what I mean. And if you don't know what I mean, he was having erectile dysfunction. So, he was like Floppy Richard. That's not what they called him, that's just what I'm calling him. I guess the girls just couldn't get a rise out of his little Richard. Obviously, this made him extremely embarrassed. I mean, I get it, I'm embarrassed for him and for the girls. Eventually, he ended up going to a doctor, which recommended a psychiatrist, since it didn't seem to be anything physically wrong. The psychiatrist suggested that he might have some possible pent-up rage or mental illness, which may be the reason. Of course, instead of listening to the psychiatrist and getting more help for his mental health, he fixated on there not being enough blood in his body to circulate to his little. Richard started using drugs and alcohol and became a little wild child, which normally I would say isn't abnormal for a teenager, but he was doing drugs very often, usually LSD, amphetamines, and some of the devil's lettuce. At 15, he had his first run-in with the law. He was popped for possession of marijuana, and his father refused to buy a lawyer, which really pissed him off, so basically both of them just added more and more fuel to the fire of their toxic relationship. Though he was partying and doing drugs all the time, somehow he pulled through and he graduated in 1969. His parents rewarded him by buying him a Volkswagen. After becoming an adult, Richard was less invested in his friends. He grew his hair out, he stopped bathing, and he just let all of his hygiene go. His long hair and drug business was really setting his father off, but his mother could really care less. Either his mom was a moron or she suffered guilt from staying in the marriage, and Richard's suffering because of it. But as we see time and time again, coddling your child's bad behavior is enabling, so stop fucking doing that. With the pressure on him, Richard finally decided to enroll in the American River College, but he did not do good in college at all. He was expelled quickly because of absences. After being expelled, he moved in with some roommates, some people he knew from high school, and he drove them completely freaking crazy. He was constantly doing LSD and smoking weed. He would get more and more paranoid, saying that people were after him. He destroyed his room by putting holes and nails in the closet, saying that people were trying to come through or talking to him. He wasn't working, so he was up all hours of the night being a freaking weirdo, and his roommates were trying to sleep. He was disgusting, he didn't shower or clean, and he would walk around the house naked, refusing to put clothes on, even though his roommates at the time were women, and his parents were paying his rent. I guess these roommates would throw parties sometimes, and he would be all weird as fucking high, and he would just lay on the floor making weird noises, and when people would try to talk to him, he would just make noises instead of holding a conversation. He's just tripping balls all the time. At one party, he waved a loaded handgun out of the window. The guy just sounds like a total asshat. I would hate to live with him too. These chicks couldn't handle living with him anymore, and instead of confronting him because he's actually crazy, they just packed up and left. Richard loved this though. He loved to be alone and naked and cracked out or hallucinating depending on what drug he got his hands on, and just doing whatever he was doing. But the dude didn't have a job and wasn't paying rent, so he wasn't able to afford the total rent. Look, the guy has a pretty good IQ. I mean, I think it's like 95 or something. So he's not lacking intellectually. I'm pretty sure that's like mid-average range IQ, but the drugs just took over his mind, you know? Anyway, he got a new roommate, which I guess was his ex-roommate's brother, but I honestly don't understand why this guy would move in with him knowing what happened with his sister, unless it was maybe to keep an eviction off of his sister's record. But anyway, Richard obviously annoyed that dude too, but this guy actually kicked him out. His parents separated and he moved back in with just his mom. He was tripping all the time and paranoid as ever and accused his mom of trying to poison him. Like, oh, the irony she must have felt here. You remember? I told you to remember. Please remember that she thought that he was trying to poison her for later. He kept getting more and more delusional, gaining actual bloodlust. He decorated his room in photos of human hearts that he cut out of books and all this other weirdo shit. He remained unemployed, doing drugs, but he did have 2 dogs though. Their names were Sabbath and Heavy, so that's probably the only cool thing about him. Richard went on a road trip in Utah and he was arrested, but his mom bailed him out, blah blah blah, she's an enabler, and he claimed that the cops tried to strangle him and poison him, blah blah blah, he's paranoid and on drugs. Their same old bullshit. He started getting physical towards his mom and his little sister. He basically moved back and forth between each of his parents' houses and also to his grandmother's house in LA when they couldn't handle him anymore. In LA, he worked as a bus driver for handicapped children, which is frickin' terrifying. But he was fired, mostly because he wasn't doing any of the extra tasks like cleaning the bus or anything like that. He got worse and worse, and by the age of 23, he started to believe that his heart would stop beating, his stomach was on backwards, and his skull was opening up. So he actually, at some point, shaved his head so he could monitor the bones and make sure that they weren't pushing through. He also thought that somebody had stolen his pulmonary artery. I guess he just kept begging his mom to take him to the hospital, and she kept refusing to take him, but finally one night she called a paramedic. The paramedics refused to treat him because he was fine besides being dirty and odd, and the paramedic suggested that she take him to the hospital for an obvious mental evaluation. So she did, and at the hospital he was evaluated for physical symptoms and he was fine. But what happens when you go to the hospital claiming that someone steals your pulmonary artery? You're going to be held for a psych evaluation. And at that time he was then diagnosed as a paranoid schizophrenic. I want to be very, very clear here that anything I say about Richard does not in any way depict people with paranoid schizophrenic disorder or any type of schizophrenia. This man was not only suffering from this disorder possibly, but he was also taking psychedelic drugs, speed, and drinking heavily. I worked with many people who had schizophrenia, and they were some of my favorite people. Living with these disorders, when they're untreated, is scary for everyone involved, especially the person suffering. And to be clear, the majority of people with this disorder do not turn into serial killers. So this dude was supposed to be held for 72 hours, but the staff wasn't paying attention and he bailed. His mom refused to let him stay there and said they'll just deal with it at home. So how did that work out for you, lady? Beatrice? Hello? Is it going good? No? His mom even got aggressive and they basically said like, whatever, good luck, lady. And the doctor actually called her the so-called schizophrenic's mother. So whatever that means. Her taking care of it at home was essentially him throwing violent tantrums, running all over the place, being a little weirdo, breaking all of her belongings. His sister and mother were just completely terrified of him, and they would leave the house any time he started to throw a fit. He stopped eating, thinking he was being poisoned by his mom. Ding, 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 it's your fault. He strapped orange peels to his head, thinking it would help him. Instead of chocolate milk, he drank milk with soap in it. And he's just like doing the most. His mom called up his dad and blamed him for all the chaos, saying he was making Richard do it. So mental illness kind of runs in the family, I assume. And then he started torturing animals again. He was abusing the family dogs. I don't know too much about that except that he squeezed the dog's head so tight that he almost broke his snout. And it took him a really long time to recover and eat food again. His parents basically gave up on this home treatment, and what did they do? Well, they put him in a psych ward to get help for his mental health. Psych, they got him his own apartment. Richard believed that his body didn't have enough blood, as we know, so he got the brilliant idea to drink animals' blood. He would buy a steady supply of rabbits from the rabbit farm, cut them open, suck the blood out of them, and eat their flesh raw. Then he would strip them of their fur and most of the bones, and he would, he would put them in a blender, make a smoothie. And you guys, rabbit's core temperature, I looked it up, it's roughly 103 degrees. That's really warm. I can't imagine trying to drink that through a straw. Oh yeah, if you're eating right now, this may be the time to stop the video. Maybe before this warning, but oops, too late. You read the title, right? Vampire blood. It's blood. Vampire blood. Same. Richard's father would visit him from time to time at his apartment and bring him groceries and chill with him because, like, he didn't have any friends. And one time the neighbor lady asked, like, hey, why do you have all those rabbits? And Richard told her he eats them. His dad allegedly was just literally happy he was eating, which just shows how weird both of these parents are. I can't even. But one time when his dad stopped by, Richard told him he got a rabbit that he thought had eaten battery acid and he was getting really, really sick, so his dad had to take him to the ER. At the ER, he told the doctor what was up, like, with the rabbit or whatever, and told the doctor that his blood was turning to dust. So the doctor was like, whoa, wait, what? And the doctor interviewed the parents, who explained to the doctor that Richard was heavily using LSD and speed, which, where did he get the money for that? You tell me. Come to find out, he didn't eat the rabbit. He actually injected himself with the blood. So the doctor diagnosed him with paranoid schizophrenia with somatic delusions and blood poisoning. He was there a while and then recovered, and then they sent him to the psych ward on April 26, 1976. At this point, he's almost 26. This hospital couldn't deal with him, so they transferred him to Beverly Manor, which specializes in psychiatric care because they didn't have the resources that he needed. At Beverly Manor, he kept telling everyone there that he needs blood to feel better. He started to tell the staff and the patients that he ate raw flesh at home and that he needed to consume blood daily. They nicknamed him Dracula, which is pretty fitting, I guess, since they found dead birds in his room with their heads removed. And multiple people actually quit working there after dealing with him. Richard was now being medicated and kind of realized he was going to be stuck there forever if he didn't straighten up. So he started being more social, participating, and taking his medication properly. His doctor there was completely blind, I guess, and said that he was not a threat to himself or others and could be released. Even though all of the staff was begging to keep him in there because he was such a danger to society. The staff later claimed that the doctor did this because the facility was overcrowded. And I would like to say, in my personal opinion, that this doctor failed miserably, and he probably thought the Hippocratic Oath was called the Hypocritical Oath because, seriously, who would let this guy out? You couldn't let Walter the Wall liquor out? You let the dude who's decapitating birds and drinking their blood out? What kind of doctor was this? About 5 months after being admitted, Richard was a free man roaming the streets. He was put in a conservatorship with his parents, who were then in charge of him and his finances, and he started getting social security checks. The conservatorship lasted about a year, and then it came time to renew it, and they believed him to be all better and declined to renew. Richard's mother said she started noticing side effects from the medication that she didn't like. Her son became zombie-like. No, not like eating brains, y'all. He was already doing that, right? Lethargic, okay? So she took it upon herself to wean him off of this medication without consulting a doctor. And at first, he seemed to be doing just fine, and that's probably because she was weaning him slowly. But then he started getting paranoid again, rambling about UFOs. He thought the Nazi organization was coming after him. He started doing street drugs again and started saying weird things about his health. He started abusing drugs and the family dogs again, and ended up killing both Heavy and Sabbath, which is totally lame because remember when I said he was arrested in Utah? Well, he actually took the dogs with him, and when he was arrested, they took the dogs to a shelter, but his mom bailed him out. I'm just not a big fan of her. So yeah, he kills their dogs, whatever, and they don't report this or anything. He's still free, and one night his mom heard banging on her door. Richard was still living in his apartment at the time, so she assumed it was him and didn't want to open the door because she didn't really want to deal with him, and he wouldn't go away. He just kept knocking and knocking, and she just kept ignoring until she heard a gunshot. So she opened the door, and it was her son, covered in blood. He was holding her cat by his tail. She watched him throw the cat to the ground and rip his stomach open, smearing its blood all over his face. And what did she do? She took him to the psych ward to get help, of course. Psych again, she closed the door. After this, he started to walk around the apartment complex with guns that he had started to acquire as his new hobby, because he's getting that Social Security money now. But the neighbors started complaining to the landlord, and so the landlord told him he needs to conceal the weapons if they're outside. So this freaking weirdo would carry the guns and then just put a blanket on top of it. So now he has guns. This is why people want to regulate guns. It's because of people like Richard Chase. Richard walked up to one of the female neighbors, whose name I don't think needs to be mentioned. She's probably been harassed enough about this. So he walks up to her and he asks her for a cigarette. So she gives him a smoke and goes to turn away because this weird guy who has a ton of guns and brings rabbits and dogs into his apartment and they never leave is talking to her, and she's like, here you go, bye. But as she goes to leave, he grabs her, stares at her, and starts to squeeze harder and asks her, "Do you got any more cigarettes?" So obviously she's like, "Take my whole damn pack, dude." He did let her go, but this was kind of the start of him becoming aggressive with women outside of his family or psychiatric staff. Richard wanted to spread his little wings that he probably ripped off some poor bird, and so he decided to go on a road trip to Nevada. He wound up on a part of the Walker River Reservation, which was mostly inhabited by people of the Paiute Nation. Someone drove by and saw an abandoned truck on the side of the road and a guy walking into the desert with a dog. So he called it into the tribal police and the Bureau of Indian Affairs. When they arrived, they found the vehicle, a 30-30 and a .22 caliber semi-automatic. Both were fully loaded and covered in blood. Seeing this, they decided to look further inside of the vehicle. They found bloody clothes, a bucket of blood with a whole ass liver inside. So they went looking for the dude on ATVs and stuff, and they found him in the scorching desert, completely naked, barefoot, and covered in blood. Richard tried to book it, but the dude's malnourished and only eats blood, so they caught him really quickly. He told the officers that the blood was his, and it was seeping from his flesh and wouldn't stop. And that dog he had with him, well, it was nowhere to be found. Richard kept changing his story, so they brought him in for questioning. And his father, very soon after, drove out to Nevada. When the test came back for the blood and the liver, they were actually from a cow. And because this was cow's blood and not human blood or dog blood, they dropped the charges and he was released. In 1977, Richard adopted 5 dogs and kidnapped a dog. He saw that the missing dog was in the newspaper, so he decided to call and taunt the family, describing exact details of what he did to their pet to the family's daughter. The father came on the phone and asked him, like, what's your name? Who are you? And he hung up. All of the dogs that he killed, he strung up, drained their blood, and turned them into smoothies. So if you didn't hate him before, you definitely hate him now, right? Right? Good, me too. When Christmas rolled around, his mother refused to let him come over after he killed their dogs, her cat, and all that. His sister was just completely terrified of him. Being rejected at Christmas was the beginning of the end for any sanity that Richard had left. The next day, he went and bought ammo and decided that he was done killing animals and he was ready to start trying out human hunting. Richard is classified as a disorganized killer, so he isn't meticulous. He's sloppy, he's careless, and he doesn't usually have a particular target. He decided to drive around and ended up on the east side of Sacramento on December 29th in 1977. He pulled up on Robinson Avenue, saw a family unloading their groceries, and decided, that's my target. He waited in his car just spitting distance from the family, waited until the wife went inside, and shot the husband, 51-year-old Ambrose Griffin. Carol Griffin, the wife, came back outside and saw her husband laying on the ground. With his age, she was worried that he had suffered a heart attack, so she screamed for her 2 sons to come help. The neighbors heard the commotion, and they all came outside to help. The paramedics were called, and that's when it was determined that he was killed in a drive-by shooting. She said that she did hear a couple pops, but she wasn't sure what it was when she was in the house, and she didn't make the connection. This was the suburbs in the 70s, so it wasn't like drive-bys were common. Unfortunately, the cops didn't have much to go on. It was said that everybody liked Ambrose. He was a really easygoing guy with no enemies. Shortly after Ambrose's death, one of the 2 sons saw a guy walking in the neighborhood with a rifle. They both chased the guy down and cornered him until the cops came. These kids were really brave. I mean, I don't suggest doing that, but their dad just died, so I totally get it. Unfortunately, this wasn't the guy. He had a rifle and Richard used a .22 caliber handgun. Soon after this, a call came into the station and it was from the mother of a 12-year-old boy. The boy was riding his bike and spotted his favorite car, which was a Trans Am. He was stuck staring at his favorite car when the driver fired a gun at him. He dropped to the ground and luckily Richard missed and he hit a store window. The boy gave the description of a man with brown hair, a male in his 20s. The cops were at a standstill in the case and so they started searching police records in hopes to find any leads. They came across a report, and 2 days before Ambrose had died, a woman was standing in her kitchen when she heard glass break. She felt something hit her in the bun, like a hair bun, and she touched her bun and didn't feel anything. It had been about a month since this happened, but the police thought they should go and talk to the lady who had almost been shot. Yeah. Just now we should. They searched her kitchen and they found a bullet stuck in the cupboard. The bullet from the cupboard and Ambrose's death were a match. But like this woman, she had no known enemies and she wasn't even tied to Ambrose. Police did not hesitate to assume that they were dealing with a maniac who was randomly thrill-killing people, which is really good. I mean, they really dropped the ball on her for a hot second, but otherwise, they're pretty on the case. For the rest of December to January, Richard broke into houses, set fires, and a few other random acts of arson, and he trespassed into other people's houses. One of these times, the house was occupied. The woman saw this dirty, dead-eyed man staring into her house, and she hoped that the door was locked. Richard walked up to the door, and he tried to open it, but the door was thankfully locked. He continued around the house checking each window, and lastly checked the back door. The whole house was luckily locked up, but the woman met his dead gaze. He lit a cigarette and said to her, "Excuse me," and then left. Richard had a rule. If the door was unlocked, it was an invitation to come in. And this is the story that my dad was talking about when I was a little kid. He used to say, some serial killers just kill people because an unlocked door is an open invitation. And I've always tried to remember that advice. About 30 minutes after trying to open the locked door of the house, Richard broke into another home. The family wasn't there, luckily, and they arrived home, and when they approached the door, they heard someone inside. When Richard heard the family approaching, he left through the back window, and the husband heard a thud. So he ran around and tried to stop him, but Richard booked it and hopped a fence, yelling that he was just taking a shortcut. He's like, I'm just taking a shortcut. To hell. The house was robbed, but that's not all he did. Richard saw a pile of folded baby clothes, so he did what anyone would do. He peed on them. Not only that, but he took a big steaming poo on the baby's bed. Could you imagine that? What the fuck? Ugh. Directly after that, Richard went to the Pantry Market, a local grocery store at the Town and County Village Shopping Center. He ran into Nancy Holden, an old school friend. Nancy had dated their peer Kurt in high school, and Richard actually dated her sister, I believe. I guess Richard wanted to mess with her head or something because he walked up to her and asked her, "Weren't you on the motorcycle when Kurt was killed?" She was taken back and didn't recognize this guy, so he introduced himself as Rick, which is his nickname in high school. He was dressed in this large winter parka that was bright orange, looking like Kenny from South Park. Nancy tried to avoid him, but he just kept following her around, so she decided to make some small talk. He was speaking incoherently to her and making her grow more and more uncomfortable, so honestly she just gave up on her shopping and headed to the checkout. He then followed her outside and was saying that he needed a ride and had to get out of the area quickly. She threw her groceries in her car and locked her door and sped off. She barely escaped him that day. Richard was not only obsessed with blood, but his idol was the Hillside Strangler, which the Hillside Strangler is actually two men that are cousins, but they didn't know that at the time. These men were known for torturing, assaulting, and strangling women in the LA area. This brings us to his next victim, Teresa Wallin, a 22-year-old woman. On January 23rd, 1978, Teresa was about to take the trash out, and Richard entered her home with his .22 caliber pistol. He startled her, and she raised her hand up, and he shot her through the hand. That shot went down her arm, through her elbow, and hit her through the upper part of the skull. Then he shot her again, but this time he hit her in the jawbone and fractured it. Then he stood above her and shot her in the temple. After killing her, Richard dragged her body to the bedroom where she was sexually assaulted, and for the first time, Richard was aroused by a woman. He then went to the kitchen, grabbed a knife and a yogurt container, sliced her torso, pulled out her intestines and spleen, cut off her left nipple, stabbed her in the lung, liver, diaphragm, and breast, cut out her kidneys, put them back inside of her body but in her chest cavity, and put blood inside of the yogurt container to drink her blood later. He admitted that he licked her blood off of his hands when he was done. He then went to the yard, picked up a piece of dog poop, and placed it inside of her mouth. Teresa was 3 months pregnant. Richard then went into the bathroom, washed himself up, washed the knife, and then he left. Her husband found her dog shaking outside when he came home, and he went inside, saw bags sprawled out all over the floor, and what looked like motor oil smeared from the living room down the hall into the back bedroom. And then he found his wife in that horrible state. Man, I feel so bad for him. That time, several witnesses came forward and gave the description of a dirty, skinny white man in an orange parka. And the mother of a 5-year-old came forward saying that her child found a knife in the storm drain. But Richard didn't stop there because he's on a killing spree. 4 days later, on January 27th, Richard entered the unlocked home of 38-year-old Evelyn Murrah. Evelyn had her friend Dan Meredith over. He was age 51. Her 6-year-old son Jason was getting ready to go to a friend's house, and she was also babysitting her 2-year-old nephew, David. Dan was in the hallway, and Richard immediately killed him with a shot to the head. Evelyn had been taking a bath when Richard entered the home, and she was found with a gunshot wound to her head as well. But her abdomen was cut wide open. One of her eyes was pulled out of the socket. She was stabbed in the anus, which went clear through to her uterus, and he did that several times. She was sexually assaulted, and her blood was also collected. He then left the bathroom. At that time, the 6-year-old Jason tried to run past into his mother's room, but he was seen by Richard. Richard shot 6-year-old Jason twice in the head, but luckily kept his body intact otherwise. Jason's friend from down the street was sad that her friend Jason didn't show up, so the mother sent her to the house to go get him. I read that they were supposed to go on a trip to the snow, and he had just gotten a new jacket or something like that. Anyway, she saw someone inside, but said they wouldn't answer the door. The neighbors started to get nervous and entered the house, where they saw Dan in the hallway, and they called the police. 2-year-old David was missing, but there was a gunshot in the pillow in a child's bed, and it was soaked with blood. There were also bloody footprints that matched the crime scene from 4 days earlier. A neighbor girl came forward. She was about 11 years old, and she described a man to police as 20. He had walked over and asked people if they had any magazines, and he was wearing a parka. Richard had taken baby David's body home, decapitated him and ate some of his organs. Due to the brutal series of murders, the FBI was called in. They, along with the Sacramento Police Department, made a profile of the killer, and they were dead on. The profile was white male, aged 25 to 27, thin, undernourished appearance, single, living alone in a location within 1 mile of abandoned station wagon owned by one of the victims. That was Dan's station wagon. Residence will be extremely unkempt, and evidence of crimes will be found at the residence. Suspect will have a history of mental illness and use of drugs. Suspect will be an unemployed loner who does not associate with other males or females and will probably spend a great deal of time in his own residence. If he resides with anyone, it will be his parents. However, this is unlikely. Suspect will have no prior military history, will be a high school or college dropout, probably suffers from one or more forms of paranoid psychosis. After the police released the suspect profile and description of the man who had been seen wearing the orange parka, Nancy from the grocery store, remember her? That he went to high school with, she calls the police and is like, yo, I think I know who did this. The police now had a name. It was Richard Trenton Chase. Rick. On that same day, on January 27th, 1978, the police went to the apartment to question and arrest Richard. Luckily, they had his address because when he was arrested in Nevada, remember that? The Paiute Reservation? He gave them the correct address. They drove up in unmarked cars and knocked on the door, but he refused to come to the door. The neighbor said he never opened the door, only a crack, and he was so paranoid they wouldn't even open it for his mother. His mother later said that it's because he was a victim of LSD abuse. They needed to act fast, and some of the officers went to the landlord and called Richard on his home phone. He answered, so they knew he was home, and the police outside of the apartment pretended to have a discussion about giving up, and they pretended to walk away. They hid down each side of the hallway. Richard opened the door in his orange parka, carrying a cardboard box, and he was completely covered in blood. Richard was heading towards the parking lot and was surprised when one of the investigators was at the end of the hall. He turned and went to run opposite direction, but the other officer was blocking him. He threw the box at the officer who blocked it with his gun, and then he hit Richard in the head with his gun. There was a bit of a struggle, but soon Richard was cuffed. Richard tried to deny everything. He said he didn't do anything wrong, and he was acting very surprised as to why they were harassing him at his home. But then they went through his pockets and found 51-year-old Dan's wallet in his back pocket. Inside of the box was a diaper pen, keys to Dan's vehicle, bullets, blood-covered gloves, and rags, and an envelope with brain matter inside of it. When the police went inside of the apartment, they were immediately sickened by what they saw. The whole apartment was covered in blood, and I'm talking the dude painting the damn walls. It's that much blood. It was on the walls, it was on the floor, it was in the blender and the sink. This place was like a slaughterhouse. It smelled so bad he never washed his blender. The officers found organs of the women inside of the fridge, David's brain in a container, and parts of the little boy wrapped up in plastic wrap. They couldn't find the boy's body, but later a janitor found the remainder of David's body in a box at a church. On May 8, 1979, the jury found Richard Chase guilty of 6 counts of first-degree murder. Richard's defense tried to claim that he was not guilty by reasons of insanity, but due to him trying to cover his tracks, such as washing up, gloves, concealing a knife in a storm drain, and details like that, the jury declared him legally sane. He was sentenced to die in the gas chamber. If you know anything about California's death row, they are notorious for holding people alive and accountable for as long as possible. Even currently, executions are being halted, and there have not been any inmates executed since 2006. Richard was sent to San Quentin, California's oldest prison, and the only one that conducts executions in the state. If you're from Northern California, you probably know this place, and you probably know people who have been there. If you do, then you know it has a reputation for some of the most hardened and most gangster criminals. Many infamous killers have been there or are currently being held there. These people would include people like Charles Manson and some of the Manson family members, including Tex Watson, NFL players Brandon Browner and Taekwon Cox, Merrill Haggard, who saw Johnny Cash perform there and was inspired by him during his sentence, the actor Danny Trejo, Rodney Alcala, Mexican Mafia member Rodolfo Cadena, Black Panther member Eldridge Cleaver, Aryan Brotherhood leader Barry Mills, founder of the Nation of Islam Wallace Fard Muhammad, along with insane amounts of serial killers that you've probably never heard of, and I will eventually cover that in a podcast that I'm working on. I'll have a whole entire San Quentin segment. But anyway, that's kind of like the atmosphere there, right? Like hard-ass dudes. I'm briefing you this because many of the reports say that the prisoners of San Quentin were scared of Richard, but I don't believe that. Like, not at all. Richard was a skinny white boy who drank blood. Richard was a child killer. Many of these murderers were big, scary gangsters, cult leaders, and serial killers, and obviously terrorist groups who had equal to or more bloodshed on their hands than this twig. And either way, whether they were scared of him or they hated him, they convinced Richard to pocket his antidepressants and off himself, which is exactly what he did on December 26, 1980. Richard committed suicide by overdose, which is absolutely poetic. That's the same date that he bought the ammo to start his killing spree. And in my opinion, he should have started with himself that day in 1977. Well, that about wraps it up, and this is probably going to be very long, but I hope this video taught you to lock your doors and don't do drugs, okay? So, what do you guys think? Do you think that he had schizophrenia, or do you think he had drug-induced psychosis, or maybe he had schizophrenia which was amplified by drug-induced psychosis? How do you feel about his parents' part in all of this? Do you think that if they would have intervened earlier that he would have been able to be rehabilitated? I think he might have been okay if he had gotten the proper help and medication, but that's just my opinion. So let me know how you feel about this in the comments below. Thank you for joining me on this double feature of Asylum Sundays. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and share it with your grandma. Okay, don't share this one with your grandma, but like maybe the Nellie Bly one. That one's pretty chill. I hope you all have the best spooky Halloween and stay safe out there, and please lock your damn doors. Bye.
Holy Spirit, activate.
Why did I put eyeshadow on my lips? Okay, we're getting closer to the end here. Between his parents' houses, motherfucker. Line. Ugh. Who hired you? God, that whole part sucked.